Hi, my name is Jody Grass, and welcome to our study on Exodus. Today we're going to be studying starting at the end of chapter 20 and going all the way through almost all of chapter 23. And so it's a big chunk of text. We're going to not be able to study every section of it, but we're going to take kind of some simple sections and break them down. I tried to pick some of the maybe harder things or things that maybe don't settle quite right. And so we can tackle a few of those and just see God's heart in this text. We do know 2 Timothy 3:16 tells us that all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. And so if we believe that is true, then we know that there's a reason this scripture is included in the Old Testament. And so we don't want to just skip past it. We actually want to dive in and study it. We do know that this scripture is called the Covenant Code or the Book of the Covenant. There's a few different names for it. Basically what it is we just learned the 10 Commandments, and now these are kind of breaking down what that might look like to enforce the 10 Commandments. There's a quote from the Gospel of Exodus by Michael P.V. Barrett. Says Israel's faithfulness would be marked by their thankful obedience to all God's rules for living. The 10 Commandments define the parameters of pleasing behavior. The covenant codes specified how to live within those parameters. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at today is how to live within the parameters of the 10 Commandments. There's a couple things we want to know about when God wrote these laws, kind of why he wrote these laws. First of all, they were written for the judicial system. So basically for judges to look at. So just like now lawyers might have a bunch of law books that they reference to and they look for things that set precedents. And that's kind of what these laws are doing. Like if this type of thing happens, then this is the punishment that should go with it. And so it's really laws that are written for judges so that they'll know how to rule the nation. We also recognize that it's written for them for the future because they're still at Mount Sinai, but they're going to be going into the promised land. And so God is giving them the laws that they will need to govern this infant nation. Israel has been living in captivity. Well, they lived in Egypt for over 40 years in Goshen, just outside of Egypt. They have been in captivity for many, many years. They have been slaves, and they don't know what it is to be a nation. They don't know what it is to even have laws to govern their nation. And so God is really like developing this infant nation, preparing them to be a success as a nation. You know, when we're raising children, I have a 1-year-old grandson and he just learned to walk. And so he's discovering the world. So there's a lot of rules that we need to teach him. And we kind of need to put these bumpers around him, like don't touch the oven. It might be hot. Don't go into the street. You could get hit by a car. Where like my 3-year-old granddaughter knows she can't touch the oven. And she knows that she has to hold your hand if she's going to go into the street. But there's other rules and laws that we're teaching her. And so really these are even the most basic because they are a infant nation. And so God is teaching them based on that. We're going to jump into this. Again, we won't be able to cover every section, but we do want to take a look at really why God wrote these laws and kind of what they point to. So we might not be able to apply them directly to our lives today. We might not have a ox that'll gore somebody, but we do have things that take place in our lives that can be applied to these scriptures. So for an example, they're going to talk about the first fruits. We're going to learn about that. Giving the first fruit of the crop. We don't have a crop probably that we can give the first fruit from, but we do get a paycheck. And we can give, when we receive our paycheck, we can tithe off of that immediately rather than waiting till the end of the month and seeing what's left. And so there are principles in this that we can apply as well. So we're going to jump in. Exodus 20, starting in verse 22. This is titled Idols and Altars. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this, you have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. So we're going to see how these laws point to the Ten Commandments, and this law and the one we're going to talk about in just a minute point to Commandments 1-3, and that's dealing with our relationship with God. And in these laws, he's talking about God knows that the Israelites have just come out of a land that worshipped idols, and they're going to be moving into the promised land where they worship idols. And so God is saying, you need to be set apart. You need to be different. And he's teaching them what that means. And so this is a clear and concise warning. Do not go back to what you know, and do not conform to what you're going to see in the promised land. You are set apart. You are holy. God's people are to be set apart as holy. And then if we keep reading in verse 24, make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and goats and your cattle. Wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. And do not go up to my altar on steps, or your private parts may be exposed. I know that sounds a little bit weird, so I'm going to explain that. But let's first talk about God tells them to build an altar, but not to craft it out of human hands. He doesn't want them to use tools to shape this altar. And the reason is, again, they've come out of idol worship, and they have seen these idols that were shaped, crafted by human hands. And then human hands would build the altar to worship these idols that were created by man. And God is saying, no, not you, because my people will be set apart. They will be different. And so he wants them to use, he created the earth. And so he wants them to use items that were created by him to build the altar where he will be worshiped and they can sacrifice to him. Now, the steps part, I know that part is the part that sounds weird, but basically what this was is in idol worship, they had these steps leading up to the altar. And on those steps, people would have sex right there out in the open as an act of worship to these idols. And so God is saying, don't even build the steps. Don't create anything on the altar that is to worship me, where you will make sacrifice to me, that looks anything like idol worship. And so that is why that command, though it sounds odd to us, it was very clear to them because it was a normal thing in their day. God's people are set apart and are to be different than any other nation. And that's even included in the way that they worship him. When we start Exodus 21, chapter 21, verses 2-11, it deals with Hebrew servants or slaves. So let's read what that says. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. I know that that's hard to hear, but hang with me. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. And then it goes on to say, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, that she is not to go free as male servants do. So basically he's saying that if it goes on to tell us that if the man sells his daughter to become a wife of a master or his son, that she needs to remain in his care and they need to continue to provide for her, because women needed to be cared for. And so that was actually a rule that was God put in place to protect women. Okay, now we're going to circle back up to this slavery piece. This is not saying, God is not saying that slavery is okay. He is saying that that he recognizes that slavery is a part of this sinful world, and he is putting protections in place for his people, because God's people are to be protected. No other nation had any laws to protect slaves or women for that matter. In fact, it's even odd that in the Ten Commandments, God listed fathers and mothers because no nation even addressed women in their rules and guidelines. But God does, because God values his children and his people are to be protected. Now, we know that God is not condoning slavery. We even have to go one step farther and understand that the word slave that we understand the definition of is different than slavery, what God is addressing here. So we think of people who have been stolen from their homes and sold into slavery, and that happens all the time, and God absolutely speaks against that. The slavery that God's talking about is more like servitude or an indentured servant, and there's a couple of ways that that can happen. There's, in fact, 4 ways that people kind of became an indentured servant. One, maybe they can't pay back money they borrowed. They borrowed money to plant seed for their harvest, and then maybe their crop was ruined, and they didn't get any income from that crop, and they can't pay their somebody back, and so then they become an indentured servant to work off their debt. If somebody has to claim bankruptcy and they lose everything, then they would have to become an indentured servant to pay off debt. If somebody is caught stealing, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, then they not only have to give back what they were stealing, but they actually have to pay double and sometimes quadruple what the price of what they stole was. So they have to pay in addition. And if they're stealing, they probably don't have money to pay that. So then they have to become a servant, and they have until they work off their debt. And then the 4th way that somebody becomes an indentured servant is if a daughter is sold into slavery with a plan that she would become a wife of the master or of the son. And so that's 4 ways that people would become an indentured servant. And God is putting rules and laws in place to protect these people. He absolutely speaks against slavery. We're going to talk about that when we get to Exodus 21, verse 16. But that says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So the consequence, the punishment for kidnapping somebody and selling them into slavery is great. It is, you need to pay for that with your life. So God clearly speaks against that. But he also puts laws in place to protect those who are indentured servants. And notice that he says that they can only work for 6 years, and in the 7th year, they are to be set free. So even if their debt is not paid in full, they are to be freed in the 7th year. And that's so that they won't become slaves for life. That little part about a man can be set free, but if he got his wife from the master, then she needs to be left behind. That truly is a protection for women and children, because if somebody was an indentured servant, they probably don't have land or anything to go back to and no way to provide for a family. And women and children did not have a way to provide for themselves. And so instead of taking the wife and children with him and then ending up deserting them or leaving them to die because he can't care for them, this way they would at least be cared for by the master, and they would have a roof over their head and food on their table. And so it was really a protection for women and children, even though it sounds a little bit harsh to us, but those times were so incredibly different. All right, there's in verses 7 through 11, it also talks about the wife's getting her marital rights. And again, this was a protection for women. This was about making sure that a husband didn't decide he wanted somebody different. He saw somebody younger or whatever, and then not give the marital rights to the wife already in his home. And so these laws were protecting women, and women, again, no nation had any protection for women. So this is very unique in the way that God was protecting women in the laws that he put forward. The next section we're going to look at is titled Personal Injuries, and it shows the value of life. It talks about all the offenses, murders and kidnapping that are punishable by death. We know that God created man and woman. He says that in Genesis 1:27, and we hear it over and over again. We hear it again when God is giving command to Noah and his sons to be fruitful and multiply. He also gives them permission to eat anything off the land, including any animals. And in Genesis 9, verses 4-9, it says, but God is speaking to Noah and his sons. He says, but you must not eat meat that has lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So we learn here that God's people must value life, because we are created in God's image and God gave us life. And so we must value life as well. Then in the next section, Exodus 21, verses 22-25. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So again, women and children had no value in any other nations. And so the fact that God was putting a law in place to protect a woman, a pregnant woman, but also her unborn fetus, is sending a very clear message that God values life, and an unborn fetus is life. And so we know that our people are created in God's image, and he values his people, his children. And then we jump to Exodus 22, verse 2. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. So basically, this starts out talking about if somebody breaks in the middle of the night and a owner or master of the home kills that thief, that the master is not going to be held responsible for that death because he doesn't know what that intruder is going to do, harm his family. But if it's during the day, they need to catch him. He has to return what he stole, and then he has to actually pay back double what the value was. And so that's when he would become an indentured servant. We also see how this is a good example of how these laws are an example or a sample of what to do in similar situations. So, for example, it says if someone steals an ox or a donkey or a sheep, does that mean that if they steal a chicken or a horse that there is no punishment? No. It's giving a sample, an example of what to follow in this kind of a scenario. And then if we jump all the way to Exodus 23, there's a section titled Laws of Justice and Mercy. And in this section I want to talk about, starting in verse 10, it's talking about the Sabbath laws, which again points to the fourth commandment, that we need to honor the Sabbath. So starting in verse 10, for 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest and crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So is this saying that the poor only get to eat every 7 years? No. There's a couple of ways of looking at this. If somebody, a landowner, maybe owned 7 acres of land, they would put one section of it, 1 acre, they would have that be unplowed for a year, and they would work the other 6 acres. So that 1 acre that's unplowed could be a source of food for the poor, widows, and that kind of thing. And then it would rotate every year. So there would always be a acre that is unplowed. Also, all of the farmers would not be on the same schedule. So there would always be some local farm that was being unplowed for a certain year. And so there would always be provision for the poor. We see how God provides for the needy. And that should challenge us, because we also need to provide for widows and for the needy. There are many ways that we can do that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then if we jump to verse 12, it says, 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Now we want to notice here that it's not just the landowner who gets to celebrate the Sabbath. First of all, we take notice that they just came out of slavery. The Israelites did. And so there was no day off. There was no Sabbath. There was no day to worship the Lord. There was no day to rest ever. So this is a completely new concept that God is presenting to the Israelites. And not only does he say that the landowners need to rest on the 7th day, but he says, so do your slaves, and so do your animals need to rest on the 7th day. God is providing structure and teaching them what it means to obey the Sabbath, because God's people must rest. When we go on, it talks about the 3 annual festivals, the festival of unleavened bread, which is the Passover. We talked about this a few weeks ago. The festival of harvest, which is the first fruits. We talked about that just a few minutes ago, of giving the first fruits. And the festival of ingathering, and that's at the end of their season. And so these are 3 festivals that the men had to go and sacrifice to the Lord in celebration of those festivals. And then at the end of that part, in the last part of verse 19, there's this weird line, and I just wanted to address it. It says, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, there are 2 schools of thought on this. The first one is that God set this law because, again, the Israelites are coming out of a idol worship nation, and they're going to be entering into the promised land. That is idol worship. And in the idol worship, one of the things that they would do in worship to a fertility god is that they would sacrifice a young goat and they would boil it in its mother's milk. And supposedly that would help them with fertility. The other school of thought is that nothing should be killed in something that should bring life. So a mother goat's milk should bring life to a baby goat, and so a baby goat should not be boiled in the milk of the mother. Either way, these were practices that were done in the neighboring nations, and God is saying, no, you will be different. My people will not look like the neighboring nations. You will look different. Now, there are so many things that we see the way that God provides for his children. God cares about his children. He provides for those in need. We can ask ourselves, how do we provide for those in need? There are food banks we can donate food to. We can donate clothes. We might see somebody on the side of the road who's in need and provide, buy them a meal. There's many, many ways that we can provide for those in need. We can even provide a meal for a family where maybe somebody in the family is having surgery or a baby was just born. There's a lot of ways that we can provide for those in need. We want to ask ourselves, are we living in a way that honors God? That's what these laws were set up to show the Israelites, how to live in a way to honor him. Are we living in a way that honors God? Do we look different from the rest of the world? Because as God's children, we should. I also want to just take a look at how we see these laws point to Jesus. So we know that Israel has been freed from slavery in Egypt, right? We see God give laws stating that slaves are to be set free after 6 years. So he provides for freedom for slaves from slavery. And then we also know that we are slaves to sin. Romans 3:23 says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We cannot do anything to be good enough to earn our salvation. And that's what Sarah taught last week with the 10 Commandments. When we read the 10 Commandments, it reveals how much we fall short of earning our own salvation and earning a right to be in the presence of a holy God. But we also see how God provides the way to be saved from that, a way to salvation, and that is through Jesus Christ. Jesus died, he went to the cross, took our punishment on him to pay the price for our sin, because there is sin, a punishment needs to be paid. But Jesus took our place and he paid our punishment for our sin. And because of Jesus, we are set free. It is nothing we can do. We are saved by grace. It is all God. What an amazing love that God has showered on us through salvation, through Jesus Christ. I am so grateful that we're saved by grace.